Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekly reading report. It's time for our weekly reading report, Roger. That fantastic program where we talk about all the stuff that I read last week. And I didn't read a ton of stuff last week because, it's the end of the year and things are going on. But I did read some stuff. Not a ton of stuff, but some stuff. A couple of things. I read a couple of things, Roger. So let me break out my list for the 500 book challenge, the ongoing challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones, with the exceptions of newer Epic collections and DC Finest volumes. But other than those two things, what do we have on here? Okay, where did we leave off? Okay, so the last book that I talked about on this fantastic program was book number 319. That was The Shadow Double Z. That was awesome. So that brings us to book 320, which was this book. This is the Fantastic Four Strange Days, Epic Collection number 25. This one counts for the challenge because I bought it way back before the challenge started. This has stories from 1995 to 1996, and I was reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four, which ran from 1962 up through 1996. My last Epic Comic Book Wednesday, I talked about that experience of reading every single issue of the Fantastic Four from its first run. It was marvelous. I loved it. It was a great experience. It was indeed fantastic, Roger, reading the world's greatest comic magazine. And this was the last volume. And I was sad when it was over, because this is great. This is actually a really good Epic collection. It has the last issues that were illustrated by Paul Ryan. And yeah, he was great on the Fantastic Four. Reed Richards had returned finally, and we just got some great issues of the Fantastic Four before it was all over. The last couple issues were illustrated by Carlos Pacheco, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, it was Carlos Pacheco, still written by Tom DeFalco. But this basically was the last few issues were set up for Onslaught and the end of this phase of the Fantastic Four's existence, before they vanished for the whole Heroes Reborn nonsense event. And Carlos Pacheco changed their costumes for 2 issues, and they were good. This whole Epic collection was really good. And I was sorry to see the Fantastic Four go, because I was reading Fantastic Four for every day for over a year, and yeah, I'm going to miss these characters. But now I've moved on to The Amazing Spider-Man, and I've been reading The Amazing Spider-Man. I'm going to read every issue from The Amazing Spider-Man, which ran from 1962 until, I think, was it 1998? Ended up with, I believe, 441 issues, something like that, for his first run, Spider-Man. And I've read, how many have I read? It was busy last week, so I didn't read as many as I wanted to. I read 5 issues so far. The next one I have to read is when Spider-Man goes up against the Lizard. He's going up against the Lizard. And these are some of the best comic books that have ever been produced. These comic books by Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. Magnificent. Love Spider-Man. There's the first great appearance of Spider-Man from Amazing Stories. It's covered by Jack Kirby, actually. And story, of course, by Steve Ditko. It's classic stuff. And I love these first few issues. They're wonderful. And I'm going to be talking about some of the issues more in depth in the future on Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Not this Epic Comic Book Wednesday, but starting next Epic Comic Book Wednesday, I'm really going to be talking a lot more about Spider-Man. But the first 5 issues were awesome, of course. Well, we got such classic villains as Dr. Octopus, the Sandman. There's the Sandman making his first appearance. And the Vulture shows up in here. The Vulture flying around, causing trouble. And Peter Parker at this point is still in high school. Started off as a high school kid. 16 years old, I believe, when he started being Spider-Man. It's great stuff. So I'm reading that now, and it's fantastic. But what else have I read? Okay, so last week I read book number 321, which was Skullface. Actually, it's Tales of Weird Menace, featuring Skullface. So Tales of Weird Menace. Roger, you particularly like this cover, I know. Tales of Weird Menace, starring Skullface, by Robert E. Howard. This is a book put out by the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press. This is the Ultimate Edition. This previously came out in a hardcover edition with a different cover, but the contents have been changed just a little bit to make it more ultimate. But basically, this is a collection of Robert E. Howard's Weird Menace stories, which was kind of a genre in the pulps, which combined horror with detective fiction, with action. And it was a particularly pulpy kind of pulp story. And this was a really interesting book to read. I talked at length about Skullface in my previous video, so I won't go too much into the story. But it's an interesting collection. So Robert E. Howard, what he was doing was he was kind of what they would call splashing the field. He was trying to send a bunch of different stuff to different pulp magazines working in different genres because he was trying to earn his living writing. And he was doing fairly well for a guy working in the Depression as a writer. But, his main outlet was Weird Tales, and they paid on publication. They didn't pay on acceptance. So you could sell a story to Weird Tales and, wait for months before you'd get paid for it. So it was a good idea to try to write for other magazines as well. And, that's why Robert E. Howard wrote all kinds of different things. He wrote sports stories, he wrote boxing stories, he wrote Westerns, which he did fairly well at. And he wrote historical stories. He wrote all kinds of things. And he tried his hand at this particular kind of Weird Menace story, which he didn't do so well at. So the stories in this volume are not as good as his fantasy stories, of course. Not as good as his other horror stories that you would find in the horror stories of Robert E. Howard from Del Rey, for example. Not as good as his Western stories. Not as good as his boxing stories. Not as good as Elmuric. So these are not his best stories. But they're really, really interesting. This is certainly not the place I would start if I was reading Robert E. Howard. But if you're a Robert E. Howard fan, it's really interesting to read this stuff. Most of the stories in this volume were not published during his lifetime. And you could see in these stories him trying to work out how to write these stories. Because this was not, I feel, the type of story he was just a natural at. And, some of the detective stuff in here is stuff that he really didn't like writing. He didn't enjoy detective stories, and there was some detective stuff in here. So it's interesting to see Howard's working in a genre which was not, his favorite. And they're very lurid, pulp stories, because that's kind of what the genre was. And they're very violent. I mean, there's a lot of violence in Robert E. Howard, of course, but in this, there's a lot of violence. It's pretty extreme at points. And it's some interesting stuff. I could see why a lot of the stories didn't really sell. Although it does seem, at least on the level of a lot of Weird Menace stories that I've seen, and better than a lot. I think a lot of these stories they're not nearly as good as the stuff that he published regularly in Weird Tales. Skullface did get published in Weird Tales, and one other story in this volume did. And Weird Tales, that was not a high bar for pulp stories, but the stuff in here just doesn't. I think in a lot of places just doesn't really work, and you can see Robert E. Howard reusing story elements and plot points over and over and over again in the stories, which is understandable because these stories, most of them, were never published. So he was reusing these same elements in different stories to see if they would really click, if they could work. And a lot of times I feel like in these stories they don't. But in some stories they do. I did mention in my video on Skullface the other day, the main story in this volume, which is by far the best story in the volume. I did mention in that review, or that talk about Skullface, that there's a lot of racism in Skullface, more than you would normally get in a Robert E. Howard story. That's certainly true of the rest of these stories in this volume, which was very typical for pulp stories of this kind. That was not unusual at all. And you certainly get that in this volume, more than you would get that in, I think, any other kind of story that he wrote. Although it was always present here and there. But here, wow. But so was a high degree of action. These are kind of extreme, super pulpy stories. And he does put a lot of action in these stories. A lot of what's going on, like I said, is stuff that happens over and over again in the stories because of, like I said, they were never published and he just kept working on them. But a couple of the stories were published, and a couple of them were actually pretty good. Black Wind Blowing, the last story in this volume, which was published, not in Weird Tales, but in another magazine, that was pretty good. Black Wind Blowing. I thought that was actually pretty good. There's a story called Guests of the Hoodoo Room, a story involving cannibalism, which was interesting because elements of that story were used later in a Conan story later on in his career. The Devils of Dark Lake. Black Hound of Death was actually published in Weird Tales. Not one of Robert E. Howard's finest, but that was published in Weird Tales, I believe, after his death, I think. And then there's some fragments and things at the end. There's a partial story called Taverel Manor, which is interesting because it brings back Gordon and Costigan, the main characters of Skullface. So it's kind of a sequel to Skullface, Taverel Manor. Unfortunately, that story was not finished. It's interesting because it doesn't feel like the rest of the stories in this volume, really, in that it seems to be... It feels very much like Arthur Conan Doyle. I feel like Robert E. Howard had just read The Hound of the Baskervilles before he wrote that story, because there's a lot of Hound of the Baskervilles in Taverel Manor, along with a lot of the elements you see in the other Weird Menace stories in this volume. But it moves at a much slower pace, and it's actually pretty good. I could see why he didn't continue it, though. It's odd because it's a kind of a sequel to Skullface because it has the same characters, but Skullface was a first-person story where Costigan is narrating the story, and that's part of what gives that story its power. Is Costigan, the drug addict hero of that story, narrating the story. Here, it's not told first person, and Costigan is in it, and he's kind of a taciturn, sulky guy in that story. And Gordon is clearly the main character in this story. But it doesn't have that breakneck pace that Skullface had. It has a much slower pace, kind of a mystery of what's going on in this manor. It does have action, but I can see why it wasn't continued. And Skullface, at least by the end of the fragment, is not in the story. But we don't know, since that story was not finished, we don't know if Skullface ever does appear, whether or if Skullface was ever intended to appear in the story. Maybe he shows up at the end, or would have showed up at the end. It's unfortunate that it was not finished, just because I want to know what happens. Because, it was actually pretty good. And I think that's the story that was finished by Lupov. I'm forgetting Lupov's first name. It's early. Richard Lupov. I think that was the story that was finished for the Skullface paperback from Berkeley Books back in the 70s. I'll have to read that book now, just to get an ending to that story, even if it wasn't Robert E. Howard's ending. I'm sure Lupov put Skullface in it. I can't remember. I haven't read that story since, I think, the 80s, as finished by Lupov. But this is a really interesting volume. If you are a Robert E. Howard fan, man, you definitely want to check this out, because it's kind of fascinating. Even when Robert E. Howard was slumming in a genre which he didn't particularly care for, he still made it entertaining. He always made what he wrote, usually, most of the time, he at least made it entertaining, even if the stories were kind of ridiculous. And these stories, a lot of them are kind of ridiculous in their over-the-topness. But that in itself makes it kind of interesting to read. So, yeah, Tales of Weird Menace by Robert E. Howard. Like I said, not a place I would start with Robert E. Howard. But if you're already a fan, you definitely want to check this out. And I applaud the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press for publishing this. They're publishing everything Robert E. Howard that was not covered in the Del Rey volumes. And I appreciate that they're publishing this. They're not, this is all published as Robert E. Howard wrote this stuff. No sensitivity readers and editors in this volume. This is all exactly as Robert E. Howard wrote it, directly from his typescripts, if they're available. It's interesting. So yeah, Tales of Weird Menace from Robert E. Howard. I read that. I only got one thing in the mail of note, other than the giant box I opened. I guess that was in my last video. Except for the giant box that I opened, I only got one thing in the mail. I think... No, wait, that's not true. Hold on. Okay, I got two things in the mail. The thing that I remembered, which is this is Weird Frequencies. Strange stories by stranger authors, edited by Jay Swick, who is the guy who runs the booktube channel Puulp Mortem. And this looks like an awesome anthology of stories written by different booktubers. And so that's really cool. Weird Frequencies. Thank you for sending that to me. I'm assuming it was Jay Swick of Puulp Mortem that sent me the book. I just got it in the mail the other day. Great cover, too. Who does that cover? Let's find out. John Chapman does the cover, which is awesome. And it's like a cool mass market paperback size book, so that's really cool. So yeah, I'm going to be reading this, but probably not until January, actually, because this month is going, man. So thank you very much for sending me this book. Like I said, bunch of booktubers wrote stories that are in this volume. So it's really cool to get. Weird Frequencies. So yeah, I'm going to be reading this in the nearish future as soon as I get a chance, and I do appreciate getting it. That's fantastic. And I've heard good things about this book, Weird Frequencies. I've heard good things. So I got that. And then I got this thing, which is really cool, but I somehow forgot that I got it, which is Wonder Woman, Introducing Wonder Woman. This is a DC Finest volume that publishes the original Wonder Woman stories. These are the first Wonder Woman stories. And I was really happy to get this because I don't have that first Golden Age Wonder Woman omnibus, which had all of these stories reprinted in it. So I'm really glad that they published this with all of these original old-timey Wonder Woman stories. Most of these I've never read. I've never read a lot of these older, well, most of these older Wonder Woman stories. So that's really cool. I look forward to reading this whenever I can get around to it. So yeah, Golden Age Wonder Woman, introducing Wonder Woman, DC Finest. So I got that. So what am I reading right now, Roger? Well, right now, I just started Full Moon. It's Full Moon, which is the second Dresden Files book. I really enjoyed the first Dresden Files book. So now I'm reading the second one. And as I suspected, there are werewolves in this book, which, you know, I figured from the title, Roger. You never know, though. But yeah, there are werewolves in this book. But I really don't know much about it at this point because I literally just started it. I have this on as an ebook. I have most of the Dresden Files books as ebooks. So this one I will tell you more about next week after I'm finished with it. But so far, just from the little bit I read at the beginning, it's pretty darn good. So yeah, I'm reading this. I'll tell you more about this next week. So there was that. And after that, I probably will be moving on to your cheap old book club, Roger, with the last cheap old book club pick, which is Amu by Herman Melville. I might be reading that after Full Moon, or I might read Doc Savage, because those are the two things I need to read for the rest of this month, is Doc Savage, the man, I think it was The Man Who Shook the Earth, and your book club pick, Amu. Omu? Amu. I don't know. I will catch you next time.